Okay, so now that we've taken a look at how we use the database class, we're going to actually start to go ahead and build it now. So I have two blank files here. One's database.php, that's within my classes directory, and I've got index.php, which we are going to instantiate the class and start to read data from our database, our MySQL database. Now, in the first part of the tutorial, we looked at this, so we're going to not specifically be focusing on how we instantiate and what we're passing through. We're obviously going to be building this database class. So let's go ahead and crack straight on with the code. So the first thing to do is actually to create the class, and that's it. With class database and then these two curly brackets, we've created a valid class. Now inside, we're going to need to give this some properties. Now these properties are going to be protected properties, and the first thing we need is the link, which is the link to the connection, which we're not directly going to be using elsewhere. We will do with the query. This really applies to if you have sort of several connections at once, but you know, it's good practice to do this anyway. We're going to have a result property, and we're going to have a num rows property, which is going to be set whenever we query the database. We're going to return the row count and then apply that to that property. But you'll see this all makes sense in a moment. So we need three protected properties: link, result, and num rows. Now there's no particular reason I've made these protected. The only reason is that so these cannot be accessed outside of this class definition, or it can be accessed within this class. So when we've instantiated the class and we use methods, the methods inside of this class can access these. If we create another class and have it as an extension of this, that class can then use these, which is very useful, but they can't be directly accessed outside of the class. So we can't just instantiate the class and start reading these on this page, for example. We need a method that returns it, if anything. But that will make sense, you know, play around with public, protected, private if you aren't comfortable with this. So the first thing we want to do is connect to our database. Now we don't want to instantiate our class, have a separate method for connecting. We want to create a constructor method which allows us to pass in 4 parameters, which is the server, the username, the password, and the database when we create the class or when we instantiate the class. So we have a public function. We have a double underscore construct, and that's our method. So in here we can pass through or give the arguments or parameters that we want to be passed in. So the first one is string data, it's a server. The second one is the username. This one here is the password, and this one here is the actual database that we're connecting to. So in here, what do we want to do? Well, we need to assign a connection to the database to this link here, and that means that later on when we use query, we can access this as a property. So I'm going to say this and a hyphen and a greater than sign. So we're accessing this underscore link, so we're accessing this property, and we're setting that value to the result from MySQL Connect server username password. What we're then doing is we're saying MySQL select DB, and we're selecting this DB, and then we're utilizing the link that we've already stored this connection to. So I'll run over this again. When we instantiate our class, we're constructing, we're passing through a server, username, password, and a DB, as you saw in the last part of the tutorial. What we're then doing is we are connecting to the database, so we're using server, username, password from here, and we're storing this inside this link here. Remember, no $sign here, just use as an underscore link. And we're storing this in here. We're then selecting a database utilizing this link here. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So we want to require once classes / database database.php, and we want to say db is equal to new database. Now, we're not going to pass anything in, and we'll see we'll get a bunch of errors. There we go. That's just basically because we have four missing arguments for the constructor method. So we need to go ahead and pass these in, which is localhost, root, and website for the database. So when we refresh, nothing. Perfect. So the next method we need to create is a disconnect method. Now, I've just included this basically because it utilizes link again, so it just sort of reinforces what we've already looked at. But this isn't required. We'll go ahead and add it in anyway. So the method name is disconnect, and all we need to do is say MySQL close. Now, what are we closing? Well, we've stored the connection in link, so we just say this underscore link. So here, down here somewhere, we can say db disconnect, and everything can be done inside here. So let's just check we've got no errors. Seems okay. Okay, so the next is the query. So this is the sort of meat of it, where we're actually passing through a string, which is an SQL query. We're querying the database, and then we're going to set the number of rows that are being returned into this property here. So the function is called query, and we want to pass in an SQL string. Sorry, not a colon on the end of there, brackets. So we're passing in an SQL, which is a string. Bear in mind, we're not looking at security from this point of view. Just to mention, we're not escaping anything. I just thought it'd get in the way of the tutorial. You could go ahead and create a sanitized method, something like that. But you know, bear in mind, this isn't sort of directly available, directly or immediately good to use. You'll need to include some kind of sanitization in here. So what we want to do, well, we want to query the database, which we would usually say MySQL query SQL. We're going to pass an additional parameter to here, which is this link, because we're utilizing the link that we've already created. Additionally, we're then going to store the result of this inside of result here, so later on we can sort of do things with it. So this result is equal to the result from, or returned from, or the resource returned from MySQL query. What we're then going to do is set the number of rows, so we can do this within the query, and I'll explain in just a moment why we do it here and not in a separate method, why we don't use the MySQL numRows in a separate method. So this underscore numRows is equal to MySQL numRows, and from this result. So we've stored the result from this query, and now we're setting the numRows from the return value of the MySQL numRows function from the result we've already stored this query into. So it's sort of like chaining down, really. Okay, so let's just tidy this up. Okay, so the reason that we use the numRows in here and then we create a separate method for the number of rows is because in our example we used the numRows method twice. We'd already queried the database, but we wanted to display or use the numRows twice. The first time we used numRows was to check if the number of rows didn't equal 0, so we could go ahead and loop. The second time we used it was to output the value onto the script, onto the browser, and tell the user how many articles had been returned. Now, if we had the MySQL numRows function inside of this, let me just create it, public function numRows. So if we had the MySQL numRows function in here, we call this method twice, we would be using the MySQL numRows function twice, so double the power that we would require. Better to use it once in this query, because we're always going to be querying if we return results, and then inside of numRows all we need to do is output this value, which doesn't use this twice. So we're not just calling the function twice. You know, you might want to put it 5 different places or use the numRows value 5 different places. That's 5 calls to MySQL numRows function, which, you know, isn't great. So in the numRows function, which I've just created there and outlined, all we're doing is we're setting a return value for this method, and what we're returning is this numRows, and that's it. So now when we use numRows, it will only return the value created from the last query. So let's go ahead and just sort of fill in the gaps here. So I'm going to use db query, which we've already created, and I'm going to go ahead and select articles.title from articles, and let's go ahead reload our browser or reload this page just to check that everything's fine, and it is. We're now going to, I'm just going to echo out this db numRows. So the numRows function or method, same thing, is returning the number of results from the last query. So if we were to then say, create another query here and say limit 5, the last query is this one, and therefore the number of rows is only 5. Okay, so that's something to bear in mind. Okay, so we're doing something with this numRows method, and we are checking if the number of rows is equal to 0. If it is, we're saying no articles or something. Otherwise, now we need to loop the results. So how do we do this? Well, this one's slightly more complicated. We're going to create a method called rows, and this is going to create an array to store the data that we need. It's going to loop through the amount of rows that we have, and it's going to append an associative array of the field that we've asked to fetch to that array, and then return that array. Sounds really complicated, but bear with me, and I'm sure you'll understand. So we create a public function called rows, which is a method, and we stop the video at that point because it's getting quite long. We'll take a break, and then in the next part we'll come back to creating this rows method.